It's time for another episode of Home Truths Behind the Headlines. Alfredo, we're on to episode 4.
Yes.
The new buyer map. Come on, sound enthusiastic.
It's all changed.
What do you mean it's all changed?
It used to be mostly Brits, not anymore. And
it?
thank you for watching. That's it for today.
Brilliant. Anyway, we're going to be a little bit more detailed than that, believe it or not, because we've written a book called Home Truths.
Yep.
A Candid Analysis of the Costa del Sol property market. 468 pages, don't you know? Look how thick that is.
This is the companion podcast.
This is the companion podcast, so we need to pad it out a little bit like we did the book, because the book is very informative. We've had, I think, 9 or 10 reviews now on Amazon, and they've all been 5 stars.
It's amazing, isn't it? We run out of friends now, so now we get the real reviews.
Yeah. But no, so one of the big parts of the book, I think it's section 3, is a deep dive on the demographics. So who's buying, who used to buy, who's buying now, and who's going to be buying in the future. And it does change on a daily basis, doesn't it, really? I think the one thing that's really, really important for the market is the fact that we're not reliant on any one nation, are we? It used to be, as you said, at the head of the episode, it used to be a very Brit-dominated landscape. And I think now it's just multinational, isn't it?
Thankfully.
Yeah.
Because if you were relying on the Brits to provide a consistent marketplace, you'd be out of business.
Well, I know in the recent Kiro podcast that you did, where you said that, because we are predominantly English language website. Well, we are an English language website. So the majority of the leads that we get are English speaking, but also predominantly and historically, the Brits have been our biggest market, sometimes as much as 30-40% of our sales. And I think you referred to, was it 2021 after we came out of COVID, when the Brits were a little bit behind the curve in terms of being able to get here. And we didn't do a deal to a Brit for 6 months, I think.
I think you said that in a video. As of June, you had sold to one British person.
Normally, we would have been like,
Yeah, that would have been like, okay, this is going to be an interesting year ahead. But you had a record year, and that just sums up the market here. That how can you have an industry sector that's doing record numbers, that's on the up, that's in a really strong position without your main buyer nationality? And that is quite simply helped by COVID. It's always been international, but COVID really does seem to have brought loads of weird and wonderful nationalities out of the woodwork. And I think we should separate one thing, is we're likely to say, well, there's the stuff that's going off in the Ukraine that's produced some input, and the stuff in the States, political is the craziness, that's done what that's done. But that's always existed in the world. What's changed is that they now think of Marbella as the answer to their problems.
I was going to say to you, what's driving this? Is it the nationalities? Is it Spain? Is it world events? Or is it a combination of all that, like a great big pie?
It's Marbella is trending.
Yeah, okay.
And this is something they've seen in other resorts. In Portugal, they've seen the same thing, in south of France, and there's, everybody's had a benefit of this. They've seen it in the Costa Blanca, they've seen it in Barcelona, they've seen it in Mallorca. There's an influx of people from weird and wonderful countries and some not so weird and wonderful countries that are looking for this sort of lifestyle. I think we have to sort of be a little bit more humble and say it's not just Marbella is the only place to be in the world, but places like Marbella that offer a huge offering of quality of life.
But hasn't Marbella always offered that? So where have these countries been?
Exactly, they've been going other places. So what there's been a little bit of a lucky scenario where Marbella has gone on the radar of a lot of nationalities that were not traditionally on the radar, like the Americans, at a time that they're looking for what this has. I don't think it's one and the same thing. I don't think they'll come out searching for us. You know what I mean? And there's one thing I would say about the nationalities that just to set the record straight for other people that maybe is oversimplifying this. Take, for example, the Polish market, which is massive here on the coast, has been for the last 5-6 years, maybe a bit longer. The conflict, yes, that has motivated them in the Ukraine has motivated more of them to get find a safe haven for their money and some for their families. But this was happening before the conflict, and this was even happening before COVID.
So the seeds were being sown anyway.
The Polish market was on the rise pre-COVID, conflict. They just accelerated it.
I was going to say, so was COVID the classic accelerator?
Yes.
Okay. Because it enabled most buyers to accelerate those plans of either early retirement or actually I don't need to retire, I can work from there, and all those things that then, like you say, if people are then looking for that lifestyle, they then have to think, okay, where are the places in the world that I can move to that are safe for my kids, that I can fly to very easily? And that's when Marbella became that hub, wasn't it?
Yeah, and even within the, when we talk about Marbella, we mean like the Greater Marbella, which is the Costa del Sol.
Yeah.
Just the Marbella is a trendier term for it now than the Costa del Sol.
California of Europe, don't you know?
Yeah, I've heard somebody refer to it as Los Angeles. Well, no, they were referring to Mallorca actually, but anyway, that's my point. It's the same thing. Yeah. The thing I think to also note is that in each municipality along the coast, you have different nationalities taking pole position.
Yeah.
So
I was amazed with was it the Italians in Benalmádena or something?
yeah, the Italians in Benalmádena, number one nationality by far.
That's mad.
That's mad because you don't see that many Italians, but then people in the know, such as Mark from Taylor Wimpey,
Yeah.
he said that's probably Argentinians with Italian passports. And I live there, so and you do see a lot of Argentinians.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes more sense. So those are the sort of nuances. Then you have Estepona, there's more Dutch people buying than Brits.
Yeah.
In Fuengirola, the Brits are they're not in the top three, I don't think. It's sort of the Danes and the Swedes and something else. So it is, not only is it sort of macro for Spain, but then you zoom into the Costa del Sol or Malaga province, which is, the Costa del Sol isn't a geographic area per se, as in it's not an officially recognized place that you get stats for.
Yeah.
It's the coastal part of Malaga province, to put it simply.
Let's talk about the Brits, because they were the pioneers, really, all those years ago, the 60s and 70s, when it used to be swinging Torremolinos and Benalmádena and Fuengirola, your neck of the woods. That's where it started, wasn't it, really? And that's why you now have the high-rise hotels and things like that.
In Torremolinos, in the 60s, the nationalities were the Americans
Wow, okay.
and the Swedes. The Americans, because of the Vietnam War, people like draft dodgers and stuff like that, hippies.
Okay.
Late 60s, early 70s.
Yeah.
And
the
the Swedes, I remember reading about something that I would say don't quote me on this, but it's a podcast. That's a stupid thing to say, but I remember reading about their summit that one of their package tourist destinations for the Swedes was somewhere like in North Africa, like Tunisia or something like that. And there was like an earthquake or something, and it kind of ruined that as a destination, and they kind of shifted.
You filmed this last night?
No, they shifted to Torremolinos, and because they started offering package holidays. Then late 70s, really the 80s was when the Brits started flocking it. That's the package holidays.
And also the cheap travel. So EasyJet
Exactly.
and Ryanair.
It was later because I was a teenager here in the 80s, and I used to fly back to the UK quite a lot to see what.
Cold enough.
It's oil of Ule, and a flight to England, a cheap flight to England then was 200 and something pounds.
Yeah.
And now that would be seen as an expensive flight to England.
Wow, yeah.
It was really the later on 90s,
Right. Okay.
late 90s. I
Because
think
that was the next surge, wasn't it? Really, with all that.
Yeah.
It was jet set travel, wasn't it?
Well, again, quoting Mark for the second time in this podcast from Taylor Wimpey. Mark, this is for you.
Yeah.
He made a super valuable point, which was to do with what are the trending hotspots within Spain, and they follow where the low cost flights are. Like that's the clearest, and where they are not explains why there isn't a market there. We take somewhere like the Almeria coast, which is great.
Yeah,
it's super cheap,
gorgeous
comparatively. It's beautiful natural landscape around there. You have deserts, you have beautiful beaches. There's a very big expat population, particularly the side of Mojácar Playa and around there. But it's never really got boom in the same way as the Costa del Sol has the Costa Blanca.
And the airport's
because the airport's useless and there's hardly any flights and it's not open. It's been terrible. That's why Alicante, where it has a tremendous international airport, and Costa del Sol.
Yeah. So Alicante, Malaga,
Mallorca, Canaries, the same thing. So that's the indicator. And really, you could take that further and say that these airline companies, their research is probably an advanced warning of what might be to come in terms of a market opportunity for agencies.
Yeah.
In the sense that if suddenly it gets announced that they're going to open 15 flights a week to Lithuania, You could almost expect there to be a Lithuanian influx
Yeah.
of buyers, because normally the buyers are the consequence of tourism here.
Because I flew into Malaga Airport on Sunday, and we used the second runway. And those two runways are being used all the time now, and they've all announced plans, haven't they, to increase the capacity. So they're going for the transcontinental flights, aren't they? They're going for the Americans and the Middle East flights, which are already there, but I think they're looking to expand it so that they become the dominant airport in the country.
There is this often talked about trend since COVID towards relocation away from just being a second home. I would take it a little further and say that it's not as straightforward as that. It's more of a hybrid thing, a hybrid living thing.
Yeah.
You know, we take the Swedes, Marbella is throw a rock, hit a Swede. Don't throw rocks, but you would assume that the figures would support that these are all living here, because you see their kids going to the school and they're playing paddle and all the rest of it. But the statistics do not support that. In the town hall, the number of Swedes registered is very low. And I did a study across the Costa del Sol and individually by town, and it's something along the lines of 80+% of all purchases by Swedish people are non-resident purchases.
Okay.
So, and I think that's also something that we should not oversimplify for perhaps the American market. When we say they're relocating here, we don't necessarily mean that they're becoming tax residents here. They might be partial, like a hybrid living thing. Spending more time. So they're not here for 2 weeks a year. They may be here for 4, 5, 6 months a year, but they're staying within that tax bracket, I think.
I think, obviously, just to finish on the British market, Brexit was a big sort of hiatus in the demand, wasn't it? Because it just made everyone think, okay, it's not as easy as it used to be. So that really, I mean, I remember when I came here 25 years ago, it was just so simple. I just didn't even have to think about visas or how long I was here for. I just packed my bags, packed up the house, bang, came here and didn't think. People can't do that now. Yeah. And I think it's a real shame that people can't do that. But it automatically meant that the people who were coming from the UK, I think, were far more considered in terms of, okay, they had a plan. They knew what, because they had to have a plan. They couldn't just arrive here and hope for the best like I did. You know, they had to have a plan. They had to be very aware. So it actually professionalized that British demand, I think.
I think what's changed since the 80s and 90s to now with the Brits and all nationalities is that it's not as much a mass market thing anymore. You know, you didn't have to be a wealthy Brit to move here in the 80s and 90s. You'd probably have to have some wealth now. You know, not necessarily if you find one little place up in the hills or something, but you know, you're spending $500,000 on a property, and even if you get a mortgage for it, with the cost and that, you got to be putting up half of that in cash.
So we're into the top.
Who has 250K cash kicking around that they didn't expect to have? You know, not regular folk don't have that, and so that changes the market. And for many, that applies to tourism as well to some degree. But you can still get a cheap holiday here, whereas you can't necessarily get a cheap property here. And that, I think, has been there's a slight rupture in that relationship between tourists come, tourists buy. Yeah. You know what I mean? I think tourists come, tourists can't really afford to buy, and something else happens.
Let's talk about some of the markets that have boomed a little bit since COVID. The American one is the obvious one because it's talked about a lot. Again, what prompted that? What do you feel are the drivers? Obviously, the COVID was the accelerator, but what were the Americans looking for, do you think?
Nobody knows. I'm just going to go out on a limb. I mean, maybe you're the one. You might be the one. I've watched everything available. I've spoken to every American I can, and nobody can put.
Are you the one that grabs them on the street?
No, but nobody can put their finger on why Marbella is on the map. They just know it is. It's getting talked about in LA. It's getting talked about in New York. It's getting talked about in Florida. People are mentioning it to each other, and it seems to be happening on a word of mouth basis,
which is weird.
Which is why, if you got how many 350, 400 million Americans, why the Americans are buying here, but they're still they're not in the top 10. Do you see what I mean?
Let me tell you what I'm hearing. So the Americans that I've dealt with, I always ask them the same question. What are you doing here? First one is that particularly we had a glut of them, didn't we? And a glut of them. And it was mainly because of the exchange rate. The dollar, it was incredibly, not fortuitous, but it was a great time to buy a euro asset. And a lot of them did. So there was that. But obviously they had a choice of areas. They didn't have to go for Marbella. And when I asked them about why, they refer to the California of Europe, some of them.
No, they don't.
No, they do. They do. They do. They've been watching our videos, don't you know? No,
We did it. We're responsible for it.
we are. I know
We
should
have
be on
made-
royalties.
You're welcome, other agents.
So the California of Europe, but the main one that was sort of like a hybrid, like reason, it was the politics in the States. So a lot of people just felt a little bit uneasy the way the politics was going. The second one was the safety for them as a family. They felt that school shootings, incidents, things like that, they just didn't want to deposit their kids at the school gates with a guy there with a machine gun. Just didn't feel right for them. So there was that, and also a lot of these Americans, they do have a European heritage. You know, there's a lot of Latinos in the States. So a lot of them have, if you look at a lot of our American clients' surnames, a lot of them are Hernandez and Fernandez and God knows what. So there is a pull. They might not have a Spanish passport, but great granny might have done. So there's that thing as well. They feel comfortable in Europe because they feel that everything is so close. In the States, you've got to kind of travel anywhere, haven't you? In Europe, you just hop on a plane, 2 hours later, you're in Rome or London. It's great. For Americans, they feel it's so much smaller.
But we still come back to what I'm saying is why now?
Why now?
Why are they hearing about it now? Meaning,
That I don't
why
know.
here? Like the stuff I'm hearing from Americans is the story I nearly always hear is that they've stumbled across Marbella. Yeah. We were looking at Madrid, we looked at Valencia, and then somebody said, "Why don't you go on and down and check out Marbella?" And we came here and we were blown away. This is it.
Because the Americans,
It's always a surprise.
Yeah.
Like we've done terrible. Let's just be honest. Our markets into America is crap because it shouldn't be a surprise. We should be telling them this is the best thing since sliced bread. And if anything, they should be a little bit disappointed it's not as good as we made out.
because the Americans
It's
have always
terrible
gone for
marketing.
Americans have always gone for cultural destinations, haven't they? That's
Yeah.
why they love Barcelona, they like Madrid, they like the cities, and they like the culture.
There's a little romance to the whole European heritage thing, like you said.
But there's not a lot of culture in Marbella, let's be honest.
Nope.
You don't come here for culture.
Nope.
But when the Americans do get here, they are blown away by it. Because they, particularly value-wise, I mean, if you're looking in the Hollywood Hills and stuff like that, this is cheap. Spain is cheap, Marbella is cheap. And also the quality of life, I think they sample it. The only thing that annoys the Americans, I find, is the service levels. So, you're in a restaurant and you want attention or you want, no, it doesn't happen, does it?
Yeah, no, I mean, the things that we know, isn't it? That the bureaucracy is a bit iffy.
Yeah.
That service is a bit iffy at times.
Yeah.
And houses tend to be a bit smaller. The space there's not as much room for things. But I still say that we would like to think that we are in control of our own destiny here, of letting the Americans know how wonderful this place is. They stumble across Marbella and they are surprised about it. So just imagine that we as an industry did a better job at actually letting the rest of them know how incredible this is. Because so far, it seems to be happening. One American tells another American tells another American.
So you're saying the Americans were an accidental market, really?
I think so. I don't think we know why they've heard about us, but we're glad they have.
I think there was a couple of articles in like the Wall Street Journal and stuff like that. But would that have prompted it?
I'm not convinced that anybody really knows the answer to that. They just know they've heard about it.
So Eastern Europe, not a dominant market, but a growing market, I would say, fueled by conflict and people's search for a safe haven, I guess. And we're seeing it not only from the obvious places like Ukraine and Poland, but also Hungary, Romania, just outlying nations where either people are feeling a little bit not quite sure about what's going on in their neck of the woods, or they're just becoming more aware of this place.
I think the Polish were in the market for Marbella and Costa del Sol before the conflict and before COVID. So for them, it really has been an accelerator. I think they are the standout. If we talk about those countries, they're the standout by far here in the Costa del Sol. They are quite often in the top 3-4 buyer nationalities along a whole long breadth of the Costa del Sol. And they, in 2024, they were like the rising stars throughout Spain in all the international buyer markets, Costa Blanca, the Balearics, etc. Costa del Sol. They were the percentage increases we're seeing there. In 2025, it kind of slowed a little bit. So the big question a lot of people say, well, is it just, has it peaked? have all the rich people left? Or bought, has that pent up demand been satisfied? And statistically, I would say it has.
Interesting, because at last year's LPA breakfast meeting, I was moderating a session and I asked the audience, what's the next country? And one of the ladies, or the only lady that responded, said Romania. And I'm seeing it. And so I don't think this is the end of the line. This is it. It's like, how many countries are there in the world? There's always someone with money to spend looking to buy either a second home or relocate or whatever it might be. I think the Eastern Europeans are one to watch. I mean, I've got them on my list as we need to keep an eye on progress in Eastern Europe. So we've talked about the Brits up and down, but pretty consistent. We've talked about the States being, the new kids on the block, so to speak. We've talked about Middle East, particularly expats escaping a potential conflict zone. We've talked about the Eastern Europeans similarly. But the one kind of area that has remained pretty constant is the EU buyer. So you're talking about the Dutch, the Belgians, the Germans, the French, the Irish. They haven't got they've got money worries, but they haven't got any currency exchange worries. They've got no freedom of movement issues. They can come and go when they want. So they are your easy clients, aren't they, really? And that is backed up by what you were saying earlier about the Dutch being so dominant. Tell us about that. They're just...
The Dutch, if I say that in 2024, the Poles were the emergent nationality, and the Americans have been creeping up all along in the background, but never to some sort of massive number.
Yeah.
In 2025, it was the Dutch. The Dutch were across all of the hotspots, Mediterranean hotspots on islands in Spain. The Dutch were the standout nationality. In Alicante province, I think they are number one. They're followed by the Brits, followed by the Belgians, which primarily are the Flemish speakers. Here in the Costa del Sol, I think the Dutch are number one in Estepona, and they're in top three. They are definitely the standout one. The short version of why the Dutch are there's such a big influx of them is more to do with unfriendly tax stuff going off in the Netherlands.
Because they're a small country.
They're a small
like Belgium. You wouldn't expect. They're punching above their weight in terms of numbers, aren't they?
Yeah. There are some rule changes to do with taxes in Holland and in the Netherlands that are very, very harsh, particularly on second home ownership. And that has meant that a lot of them are cashing in and bringing their money here. So will we continue to see it to the same levels? It's always difficult when you have a relatively small country. Has it plateaued? It hasn't yet. Will it continue to grow? It could do. I think in the Costa del Sol, like I think I mentioned just now, there are two of the maybe 6 main municipalities where they are number one.
Estepona's one, isn't it?
Estepona, Torremolinos is the other one.
I think what the Dutch and the Belgians have is a bit like the Brits. It's easy to get here. It's a couple of hours away. It's cold and rainy most of the time up there. So all the factors are there in place, aren't they? Cold, Northern Europe, they want a bit of sun, and it's easy to get to. And they're good travelers. The Dutch and the Belgians, they integrate very well.
And whereas the Poles and the Americans are newcomers, the Dutch and the Belgians have always been here.
Yeah.
So this is a country, this is someone they know.
Yeah, it is.
They've grown up coming on holiday here. There are no family that have moved here. So it's a very different, it's a home from home kind of thing.
And just to finish, so diversification of buyer demand matters, doesn't it? Because it means that we're not reliant on one source of income. And it means that if the Brits go into recession, for instance, or there's a problem, or if there's a war zone somewhere, it means there's other nations stepping in, often to find that safe haven and to make up the numbers, shall we say.
I don't see any clear nationality emerging that I think is going to be the big explosive, the way the Dutch were last year or the way the Polish were the year before.
But in a way, that's healthy, isn't it? I mean, when you look at the figures, there isn't one buying country with like 50% of the foreign market share. It's always like 15% as the top one, which I think is really healthy.
It stands out when you look at it nationally for Spain, because if you look at the top, they publish the top 25 buyer nationalities.
Right.
And if you look at that, even COVID, like the last 5-6 years, they were the top 3 or 4 were very dominant. There's the Brits with, double-digit percentage of the foreign buyer market share. The Germans just below them, about 10%. The French, they were like the top 3, 5, 6 years ago. Going back even further, so to 2008, 7, the Brits were 38, 40% of all foreign transactions of the Brits. Now there's a lot of changes in our positions in terms of in the top 5 or 6, because if you look at the figures, the top 1 is the Brits still. In fact, the top 1 is the Brits still, but it's got 8% or 8 or so percent.
Yeah.
The one below them has got 7 point something, and then really down that list, it's 8%, 7%, 6%, 6%, 5%. So what we're seeing now is when you're looking at those national stats on a quarterly basis, the top 10 are moving positions, almost like it's a Formula One racing grid. And in fact, the last quarter that we had figures available, the Dutch moved to the 2nd position, above the Germans, above the French, above all the others, and only like about 1.1% away from the Brits.
The top not.
You see, so the top 10 positions it's all changed. What you do have is below the bottom part of the graph is the ones that are still absent in percentage-wise and in actual transactions are the Swedes. They've gone quiet for the last 2 or 3 years. We expect them to be back. If there was something that maybe could be a thing that we see a lot of at some point, are the Swedes coming back into the market in force. But the bottom part of it, the Americans, the Americans are here, but as nationally, they're a couple of percent of the foreign buyer thing. So they have the potential to be massive.
Well, this is the thing. I think with the Americans, they're a very small percentage of overseas buyers in Spain at the moment. But the reason they're significant is because of the volume of opportunity.
What it could represent.
You've got not the most populous nation on earth, but you've got a huge amount of spending power there. So I think agents would be foolish to not try and tap into that.
Yeah, I don't think agents know how to tap into it. It's such a huge country.
Yeah, that's it. It's like, how do they make their decisions? I don't think anyone understands the psychology of the.
I think from a buyer point of view, final thing I would say on this whole thing is that it's very variable. In the Costa del Sol, there are a lot of nationalities that don't necessarily buy in a specific area. Yeah, you have a few things like you have nationality for the Swedes, and you have Los Pacos of Ajirola for the Finnish. But the rest of the Costa is really integrated. It's not like you might imagine, where you have this area is just Belgians, this area is just Brits, this area is just whatever. Just Americans. It's very, very mixed in together, and that's quite nice if someone's looking to buy, because it doesn't put that sort of pressure that you got to find your tribe as such. They're everywhere.
Very good. I think that covers everything. That's a little potted version of what we were writing about in our section 3 of the book. Obviously, if you'd like to own your very own copy, you can go onto Amazon in any nation that you're in and order a copy. You can buy more than one if you want. Then you can stack them up like this, and Alfredo has a special use.
Yeah, you can use it to do selfies. You put your phone like this.
Yeah.
Okay.
It doesn't quite work, does it?
Yeah. You need 3, that's right.
But anyway, thank you so much, and we'll see you on the next episode.